The crystal chandelier above table one didn't just reflect the light, it amplified the sheer, suffocating arrogance of the man sitting beneath it. Arthur Sterling adjusted his silk bow tie, his chest expanding with the unearned confidence of a billionaire political donor who bought his respect in six-figure installments. The grand ballroom at the Lexingford Imperial was packed. 500 high-profile guests, senators, defense contractors, and elite military personnel had gathered for the annual Titan Vanguard Gala. It was an evening designed to celebrate the nation's greatest heroes. Yet, for my father, it was just another stage. And I was his favorite prop to break. Ladies and gentlemen, before the main address, if I could borrow your ears for just one moment, Arthur's voice boomed, amplified by his absolute control over the room. He didn't use a microphone, yet his voice cut through the soft jazz and the clinking of silver cutlery like a dull blade. He hoisted his glass of vintage Bordeaux, his eyes crinkling into that fake, charismatic smile that had fooled the public for 3 decades. He turned that smile toward me. It felt like a crosshair locking onto my forehead. "I want you all to look at my youngest daughter, Vivienne," Arthur announced, gesturing toward me with a dismissive wave of his hand. "She's been wearing an army uniform for nearly 8 years now, but if you ask her mother or me what she actually does, we couldn't tell you. I swear, the military didn't train her to fight, they trained her to hide from an honest day's work." A ripple of polite, uncomfortable laughter rippled across our table. Beside him, my older brother, Pierce, let out a sharp, mocking snort. Pierce was wearing a tailored $5,000 tuxedo, paid for entirely by our father's offshore accounts. Pierce was the prodigy of the family, the CEO of our father's private defense charity, a man who had never seen a day of mud, sweat, or fear in his entire cushioned life. "Go ahead, Senator, ask her," Pierce chimed in, leaning forward with a malicious glint in his eyes, targeting Senator Vance, who sat across from us. "Ask her what a Special Tactical Logistics Coordinator actually means, because from where I'm standing, it looks like a fancy title for someone who sweeps the motor pool and refills the copier paper for real soldiers." The laughter grew louder, less polite now. It was fueled by Pierce's smug assurance. The high society guests didn't see the cruelty. They just saw a powerful family engaging in what looked like harmless, playful teasing. They had no idea this script had been running since I was 9 years old. I sat perfectly still. My back was a straight line against the velvet chair. My spine had been forged by the rigorous discipline of Fort Bragg and tempered in the freezing, nameless valleys of the Hindu Kush, but tonight, it was my shield against my own blood. I didn't blink. I didn't flush. I wore the cold anger, the absolute, motionless silence of an operator who measures the wind before pulling the trigger. "I serve where the Department of Defense directs me, Pierce," I said, my voice flat, level, and entirely devoid of emotion. Arthur burst into a loud, theatrical laugh, clapping Senator Vance on the shoulder. "See? That's the exact line she uses every single Thanksgiving. It's pathetic, really. Her mother thinks she's out there doing something top secret and dangerous. Personally, I think she got stuck in a basement archive in Virginia, buried under mountains of paperwork. And she just likes making us all curious to feel important." He leaned in closer over the white tablecloth, the scent of expensive wine and condescension radiating from him. "Let's settle this tonight, Vivienne. No more lies. If you're actually doing anything worth the uniform, you must have one of those ridiculous nicknames. A call sign. Even the desk jockeys get them, right? What do they call you? Major Papercut?" Pierce chuckled loudly, whispering something to the socialite sitting to his right. The humiliation was heavy, systematic, and entirely intentional. They wanted to shrink me so they could feel giant. They wanted to remind me that no matter what rank I held in the United States Army, in the Sterling dynasty, I was nothing but a punchline. I slowly lowered my water glass to the table. The glass made no sound against the linen. I looked directly into my father's eyes, peeling away the layer of submissive daughter he thought he owned. "Do you truly want to know, Father?" I asked quietly. "Enlighten us," Arthur sneered, raising his eyebrows. "Give us something real for once." "My call sign is Phantom Tempest," I said. The 2 words left my lips like ice sliding across concrete. Arthur opened his mouth to deliver another mocking retort, but the sound died instantly in his throat. Across the cavernous ballroom, a heavy mahogany chair scraped violently against the polished marble floor. The sound was incredibly loud, sharp, and disruptive. echoing like a pistol shot through the high society chatter. Every single head in the room swung toward the source of the noise. General Rachel Vance, the four-star commander of United States Special Operations Command, and a legendary figure within the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had risen to her feet. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't confused. She was staring across 50 yards of crowded tables, her intense eyes locked entirely on me with a fierce, burning recognition. It was an expression reserved only for those who had survived the absolute worst corners of hell together. The ballroom's live orchestra faded into an awkward silence, as the conductor noticed that almost all conversation had abruptly stopped. Arthur's smug grin faltered, replaced by a twitch of political panic. He looked from General Vance back to me, forcing a nervous, hollow chuckle. "General Vance," Arthur called out, his voice straining to maintain its usual dominance. "My apologies if our family jokes interrupted your evening." General Vance completely ignored him. She didn't look at his money, his tailored suit, or his political influence. She walked with rigid, measured military precision down the aisle, her dress uniform gleaming with ribbons of valor, until she stood directly beside our table. The air around us grew icy. "Major Vance," the general said, her voice dropping into a low, gravelly register that commanded absolute authority. "Would you care to repeat the designation you just stated to this table?" "Phantom Tempest, ma'am," I responded, my voice snapping into perfect military readiness. General Vance held my gaze for 3 agonizingly long seconds. Then, slowly, with a profound level of reverence that shocked everyone watching, the 4-star general delivered a crisp, respectful nod. She turned her icy glare toward my father, her posture tightening. "Sir," General Vance said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of an executioner's axe. "If your daughter has chosen to share that specific name with you in public, my advice as the commander of SOCOM is very simple." Arthur forced an uncertain, trembling smile. "And what might that be, General?" Vance didn't raise her voice, but it echoed through the silent room. "Stop talking to her like she is someone you have the right to understand. You haven't earned the right to even say her name." An absolute, deafening silence paralyzed the ballroom. Arthur waited for the general to break the tension with a laugh, to reveal it was all part of a joke, but no punchline came. General Vance simply gave me one last, meaningful look before turning on her heel and marching back to her seat. Nobody at table 1 moved. Nobody laughed. Nobody even breathed loudly, because nobody knew whether they had just witnessed a family joke or the quiet opening move of a devastating war. I calmly raised my glass, looking past my trembling father toward the stage. "The gala is meant to honor our veterans," I said softly, the subtext cutting deep into the silence. "Let's give them the evening they actually earned." The applause that suddenly erupted from the room had absolutely nothing to do with Arthur Sterling, and that was exactly how I planned it. My father remained frozen in his seat, his face completely pale, staring at me with the exact expression people wear when they suddenly realize they have been playing a deadly game with a stranger, using the completely wrong rules from the very first move. 10 minutes later, as the main ballroom lights dimmed for the keynote presentation, my phone buzzed with a fierce vibration against my ribs. I pulled it from my dress uniform pocket. A single text from my father burned on the screen. "We are going to the private lounge upstairs." Now, I didn't reply. I locked the screen and stared out the passenger window of my truck as I drove away from the Lexingford Imperial, leaving the glitz of the gala behind. The flashing blue and white lights of the city blurred against the glass, but inside my mind, the image of my father's face kept replaying. He hadn't looked angry. He had looked exposed. For the first time in his life, the illusion of his absolute control had shattered, leaving behind a profound emptiness. Most people would call that a moment of pure justice. I couldn't. Justice implies a sense of satisfaction, a clean ending. What I felt was much more complex, like an old wound being cut open with surgical precision. My mind dragged me back to when I was 11 years old. I had spent 3 weeks in our dusty garage building a small, intricate ham radio receiver from spare parts I found in an old electronics bin. I wanted so desperately for my father to look at me, to see that I could build things, that I was smart. I brought it to our annual family summer barbecue, holding it out like a prize. Before I could explain how I had soldered the connections myself, Arthur grabbed it, held it high above his head for all my uncles and cousins to see, and laughed. "Well, look at this. If the power ever goes out, Vivienne can look up recipes from the 1950s. Let's hope it doesn't catch fire first. My uncles roared with laughter. Pierce threw a handful of dirt near my feet and cheered. I laughed too, back then. I laughed because my 11-year-old brain genuinely believed that if I pretended the insult didn't cut me to the bone, the pain would somehow evaporate. It never did. It just buried itself deep inside my chest, turning into something hard and unyielding. When I was 16, I placed first in the state-level tactical marksmanship competition after spending months practicing in the freezing rain before dawn until my fingers bleeded. My instructor told my parents I possessed a rare, unshakable focus, a internal steel that couldn't be taught. Arthur had simply smiled, draped a heavy arm around my shoulder in front of the local reporters, and said, "She only shoots that well because she's trying to avoid doing her chores at home. If she cleaned her room as fast as she reloads, she'd be a genius." The reporters chuckled. The town laughed. And on the drive home, my father acted as though his mocking comment was the greatest promotional gift he could have ever given me. I never told him that I spent 3 hours that night crying under the scalding water of the shower, scrubbing my skin until it was red, desperate to wash away the feeling of being nothing more than a prop for his public image. The older I grew, the shorter my answers became. It wasn't an act of rebellion. It was a survival strategy. If I shared a dream, it became a punchline for his next political dinner. If I achieved a milestone, he claimed it was due to his genetic legacy or his money. If I remained completely silent, they assumed I was stupid and had nothing worth saying. Somewhere along that brutal timeline, silence stopped feeling like isolation. It started feeling like an armored fortress. My phone buzzed again in the center console. The exact same text. I kept my eyes on the dark road. Trust isn't something a family destroys in one massive, explosive fight. It's an empire that dissolves quietly, one small intentional disappointment at a time, until one day you wake up and realize you are sharing a roof with people who speak an entirely different language. By the time I reached my small, sterile apartment on the edge of the city, the clock read midnight. I didn't turn on the lights. I stood in the dark kitchen, staring at the flashing green light of my encrypted military laptop sitting on the counter. General Vance hadn't stood up for me out of pity. Sins of omission don't exist in her world. She had intervened because she knew the absolute, staggering weight of the data sitting inside that encrypted hard drive. For 5 years, while my father and brother were busy built a multi-million-dollar empire off their Vanguard charity for fallen soldiers, I had been operating in the deep shadows of the Pentagon's intelligence network. And for the last 18 months, my primary objective hadn't been an overseas enemy. It had been them. I opened the laptop, the blue glow reflecting off my face, illuminating the massive wall of data I had meticulously assembled. Thousands of cross-referenced shipping manifests, offshore banking transactions, and intercepted satellite communications. Pierce thought he was a genius financier. In reality, he was sloppy. My father's charity wasn't distributing medical supplies to veterans' hospitals. They were using the charity's tax-exempt cargo planes to transport illegal, unverified military-grade software and defective drone components manufactured by black market subcontractors in Eastern Europe. Those same defective parts had caused a catastrophic communication failure in Niger 2 years ago, a failure that cost the lives of 3 operators from my unit. The family had spent years slandering my military service to keep me far away from their business, convinced I was too stupid to see through their facade. They wanted me wrapped in a narrative of failure, so that if I ever discovered the truth, my voice would carry 0 weight. I stared at the latest transaction report on my screen. A $5 million wire transfer from a shell company linked to a known international arms broker, routed directly into Pierce's personal account, stamped with the Vanguard charity seal. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I could have sent this data to the federal prosecutors months ago, but I knew Arthur Sterling's political reach. He would buy his way out of a standard indictment. He would hire a public relations army to spin it as a tragic mistake by a rogue employee. No, for a monster who built his palace on public perception and the systematic humiliation of others, a standard legal battle was too merciful. The destruction had to be total. It had to happen on his stage, in front of his peers, where his money couldn't buy a single second of silence. I closed the laptop, walked out onto the small concrete balcony, and felt the bitter night wind bite into my face. I pulled out my phone, opened the text thread with my father, and typed 8 words. Tomorrow morning. 0800. The Vanguard corporate headquarters. I pressed send before my finger could hesitate. Within 30 seconds, the 3 typing dots appeared, vanished, and reappeared. Finally, a response arrived from Arthur's number. Be there, and bring an explanation for tonight, or I will ensure your military career ends before Monday. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, looking out over the sleeping city. Tomorrow wasn't going to be a family reconciliation. It was going to be an execution. The glass doors of the Sterling Vanguard Tower slid open with a whisper that felt entirely too clean for the filth hidden inside the building. I arrived at exactly 0745, wearing my full operational camouflage uniform instead of my dress blues. I didn't want the polished brass or the formal ribbons today. I wanted the fabric that smelled of sweat, dust, and high-stakes survival. The security guards at the desk immediately stood up, recognizing my face but hesitating when they saw the cold, unyielding expression I wore. I didn't wait for them to check my ID. I walked past the biometric scanners directly to the private express elevator, sliding my encrypted military credential into the master key slot. The doors closed, and the elevator surged upward toward the top floor. When the doors opened into the executive boardroom, the tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Arthur Sterling was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out over the city skyline, a porcelain mug of black coffee in his hand. Pierce sat at the massive mahogany conference table, his laptop open, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. The mahogany table was immaculate, except for a thick, blue leather folder resting right in the center. The moment the elevator doors clicked shut behind me, Arthur turned around. The charismatic, smiling patriarch from the gala was completely gone. In his place stood a desperate, angry politician whose authority had been publicly questioned. "Lock the room, Pierce," Arthur commanded, his voice sharp and venomous. Pierce slammed his hand onto a button beneath the table, and the heavy oak reinforcement door slid shut, sealing the 3 of us inside. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Pierce spat, standing up so fast his leather chair rolled back into the wall. "You think because you got some 4-star general to play along with your little dramatic stunt last night that you've suddenly got leverage over this family? You're pathetic, Vivienne. You embarrassed Dad in front of the entire governor's committee." I didn't answer Pierce. I didn't even look at him. I walked slowly toward the table, keeping my steps measured, my arms hanging loose at my sides, a resting tactical posture that made Pierce instinctively take a half-step backward. "Sit down, Pierce," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. He walked away from the window and stood at the head of the table, looking down at me as if I were a rebellious employee he was about to fire. "I don't know what kind of classified lies you've been feeding your superiors to get that kind of reception, Vivienne," Arthur said, leaning his heavy palms on the wood. "But let's establish the reality of your situation right now. You are an officer in the United States Army because I allowed it. I signed the early waiver recommendations. I funded your initial application background checks. Your entire existence is a product of my investments." He tapped his finger heavily on the blue leather folder. "This is an official non-disclosure and asset waiver agreement," Arthur continued, his eyes freezing into slits. "Your mother left a substantial portion of her estate's land rights to you in her original will. Land that directly borders the new tactical drone manufacturing site our charity is funding. Pierce needs that land cleared for development by the end of the month." "You want me to sign away my mother's legacy?" I stated. It wasn't a question. "I want you to realize your place," Arthur corrected sharply, his voice rising. "You are going to sign those documents right now. If you don't, I will call the Assistant Secretary of the Army before noon. I will inform them that you have been using your intelligence clearance to illegally spy on a civilian non-profit organization. I will have your security clearance revoked, your rank stripped, and your name dragged through every major media outlet in this country. You will be dishonorably discharged and left with absolutely nothing." Pierce smiled, leaning back against the table, crossing his arms. "And don't bother running to your general friend, sis. Money talks louder than stars in this town. We own the contracts. We own the politicians who fund her budget. You're just a speck of dust on our windshield." The room fell completely silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning. The sheer, unadulterated malice in their voices would have broken most people. It was a systematic, calculated effort to crush my spirit, to use my career as a weapon against my soul. I looked at the blue folder. Then I looked up, matching Arthur's glare with an emptiness that seemed to catch him completely off guard. There was no fear in my chest, no anger, just the absolute, pristine clarity of an operative who has just watched her target step perfectly into the kill zone. "You really believe your own stories, don't you, Father?" I said softly. Arthur frowned, his jaw tightening. What did you say? I took one step forward, placing my hands on the back of a chair. For 26 years, you've used jokes and threats to control the narrative. You told everyone I was weak, so they wouldn't look at my strength. You told everyone I was a failure, so they wouldn't notice what I was building. You did it to protect your pride, and you did it because you knew, deep down, that if I ever stood up, your entire world would crumble. Shut your mouth, Pierce shouted, his face turning a deep, angry red. You shouldn't have brought your dirty money into my theater of war, father, I said, my voice echoing with an icy authority that made the air feel thin. You think you're the ones giving the orders today? But look at the clock. It's exactly 0800. Arthur's phone suddenly screamed with a loud, aggressive alert tone. A second later, Pierce's laptop began chiming frantically with incoming high-priority notifications. Arthur reached into his pocket, his brow furrowed in confusion as he pulled out his device. The screen was flashing with a red, secure notification from the corporate server. Pierce scrambled back to his keyboard, his fingers flying across the keys as his face rapidly drained of all color. What is this? Pierce stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched panic. Dad, the corporate mainframes. They're completely locked down. Every single file, every ledger, every shipment manifest. It's all being mirrored to an external federal server. I can't stop the transfer. My admin passwords have been completely revoked. Arthur stared at his phone, his hand starting to visibly shake, as a live news notification popped up on his screen, showing a fleet of black federal SUVs pulling up outside the very building we were standing in. Vivienne, Arthur whispered, his voice losing every ounce of its previous power, his eyes lifting toward me with a sudden, dawning terror. What did you do? I didn't answer. I simply reached over, picked up the blue leather folder, and tossed it into the trash can beside the table. The tactical phase of this operation is complete, I said coldly. Now comes the devastation. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom didn't just open, they were violently bypassed. The security lock gave a loud electronic screech as a master override code was punched in from the outside. The doors slid back, and the sound of dozens of heavy, tactical bootsteps flooded into the silent executive suite. Arthur stood frozen, his hand still holding his shaking phone, as 6 armed federal marshals clad in tactical vests moved into the room, securing the perimeter with flawless coordination. Directly behind them walked General Rachel Vance, flanked by 2 high-ranking investigators from the Army Criminal Investigation Division, CID. General Vance! Arthur gasped, his political instincts desperately kicking back in like a failing engine. He took a step forward, his voice cracking with a chaotic mix of terror and false hospitality. Thank God you're here. My daughter has somehow compromised our corporate network. She's committing a federal cybercrime right inside my office. I need you to arrest her immediately. General Vance didn't stop until she was standing a mere 2 feet from Arthur. She looked down at him with an expression of supreme, unadulterated disgust. Arthur Sterling, General Vance said, her voice dropping like a physical weight into the room. You are under the absolute delusion that you are the one holding the cards here. Step away from the desk. Hands behind your back. Now. What? Pierce shrieked from the corner, his hands trembling violently as a federal agent stepped up behind his chair, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. No! You can't do this! We are the Vanguard charity. We fund the military's outreach programs. We have political immunity. You have nothing but a mountain of treason, General Vance barked, turning her head slightly toward the lead CID investigator. Display the declassified record. The investigator stepped up to the massive presentation screen on the wall, plugging in a secure, red, military flash drive. The corporate logo of the Sterling Group instantly vanished, replaced by a stark, black interface bearing the official seal of the Department of Defense and the United States Special Operations Command. Across the top of the screen, bold white letters blazed against the dark background. Operation Phantom Tempest, Anatomy of a Subversive Treason Network. As of 0600 hours this morning, by direct executive order from the Secretary of Defense, General Vance announced, her voice echoing off the glass walls, the multi-year intelligence operation known as Phantom Tempest has been officially declassified for federal prosecution, and the lead intelligence officer who designed, executed, and completed this entire operation is standing right in front of you. Arthur's eyes went wide as saucers. He staggered backward until his spine hit the glass window, his mouth hanging open in an ugly, silent gasp. He looked at the screen, then looked back at me, his brain completely shutting down as he tried to process the data flashing before his eyes. The screen showed a massive, interconnected web of international financial transactions. There were high-definition satellite images of Vanguard charity cargo planes being loaded with unmarked wooden crates in Poland. There were decrypted audio files, complete with Pierce's voice, negotiating the price of defective tactical sensor suites with a known black market broker in Bucharest. But most devastating of all was the centerpiece of the entire display, a massive, comprehensive digital ledger labeled the Sterling Blood Archive. For 7 years, Arthur, General Vance continued, her voice cutting through his panic like a razor. You told the world your daughter was a failure hiding under a desk. You did it because you were terrified she would look into your business. And you were right to be terrified. Because while you were busy giving speeches and drinking champagne, Major Vivienne Vance was operating as a deep cover analyst inside the military's most elite counter-proliferation unit. She didn't just find your offshore accounts, the lead CID investigator added, looking directly at Pierce. She tracked the exact serial numbers of the defective drone relays your charity distributed to our forward operating bases. Those relays caused a blackout during an ambush in Niger. 3 of our men died because your brother wanted an extra $2 million in his Swiss account. Pierce fell out of his chair, dropping to his knees on the carpet, his face completely wet with sweat and tears. It wasn't me. It was Dad. Dad told me to balance the books. He told me the military would never notice. Please. I didn't kill anyone. Shut up, Pierce, Arthur roared, his face turning from pale to an ugly mottled purple. He turned on me, his fingers curling into claws, his voice cracking into a desperate, unhinged scream. You did this! You malicious, ungrateful little bitch! I gave you everything. I built this family. You destroyed your own father's name for a uniform? I stepped out from behind the table. I walked up to him until I could see the sweat dripping down his temple, until I could smell the terror radiating from his skin. I didn't look angry. I looked like the storm that had finally arrived to wash his palace away. You didn't give me everything, Father, I said, my voice completely calm, completely steady, the epitome of the cold anger that had guided me through the dark. You gave me an enemy to fight. You truaned me in a fire of constant humiliation, thinking it would keep me broken. But all you did was teach me how to survive in the dark. And now, the dark is coming for you. The physical world always slows down right before the final impact. It's a phenomenon they teach you to recognize in high-stress tactical training, the way your brain processes micro-details when an entire structure is collapsing around you. I watched the lead federal marshal step forward. The silver handcuffs hanging from his tactical belt made a sharp, metallic clink as they were unclasped. The sound was incredibly crisp in the silent room. Arthur's eyes tracked the movement of those silver cuffs. I watched the exact millisecond his political mind finally accepted absolute defeat. The tiny muscles around his left eye twitched violently. A heavy bead of cold sweat broke from his hairline, tracing a slow, glistening path down the deep wrinkles of his forehead, catching the bright corporate light before dripping onto his silk tie. His chest heaved. The arrogant, broad-shouldered posture that had dominated the Sterling Group for 30 years collapsed inward. His shoulders slumped forward as if an invisible 10-ton weight had been dropped onto his neck. His hands, which had spent decades signing multi-million-dollar deals and dismissively waving away my existence, began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. Hands behind your back, Mr. Sterling, the marshal said, his voice flat and entirely empty of respect. Arthur didn't move. He couldn't. His legs seemed to turn to water. He began to slide down the glass window, his expensive leather shoes scraping uselessly against the baseboard until he was half kneeling, half sitting on the floor, his head pressed against the cold glass. The great Arthur Sterling looked tiny. He looked pathetic. He looked like an old, exposed fraud stripped of his script. To his left, the destruction of Pierce was much louder, much uglier. 2 marshals hauled him up from the floor by his armpits. Pierce's tailored tuxedo jacket was completely ruined, covered in dust and lint from the carpet. His face was completely contorted, his nose running, his mouth open in an undignified animalistic sob. Wait! Wait! Look at my computer, Pierce screamed, his legs flailing wildly as they dragged him toward the elevator. I can give you the names of the brokers. I have the encryption keys for the Bucharest accounts. I'll testify against him. Just don't put me in a federal cell. Please. I'm a Sterling. You don't understand. I'm a Sterling. You're a criminal asset, kid, the marshal said, clicking the cuffs tightly around Pierce's wrists. The sharp snaps of the lock mechanism echoed through the room like two small bones breaking. Pierce let out a high-pitched whine, his head dropping forward as he completely stopped resisting, allowing himself to be led away like cattle. Arthur watched his son betray him in a matter of seconds, his pale lips moving but no sound coming out. He looked up at me from his place on the floor, his eyes completely bloodshot, filled with a desperate, pathetic plea for family loyalty, the same loyalty he had spent my entire life trading away for a quick laugh. I walked over to the desk. Pierce's personal cell phone was sitting near the keyboard, its screen still flashing with incoming alerts from their failing offshore banks. I picked it up, feeling the cool weight of the metal in my hand. I walked over to my father, crouching down until I was at eye level with the man who used to tower over my life. I dropped the phone into his lap. You spent 26 years asking everyone what I'd do for the United States Army, Father, I said, my voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper that only he could hear. You told them I was just a desk clerk who cleaned up paperwork. I stood back up, looking down at him as the marshal stepped in to hoist him to his feet. You were wrong, I said coldly. I don't clean up paperwork. I clean up the trash. And today your entire empire goes into the bin. Arthur didn't scream. He didn't curse. He just let out a long, broken sigh as the heavy steel handcuffs were locked behind his back. The marshals escorted him toward the private elevator. As the doors slid open, the bright, expensive corporate hallways of the Sterling Vanguard Tower fell completely silent behind them. The dynasty was dead. The field of battle belonged entirely to the Phantom Tempest. The federal courts don't move fast, but when an intelligence operation is backed by a 4-star general and a mountain of immutable data, the gears of justice grind with terrifying efficiency. Within 48 hours, the Sterling Group's assets were completely frozen by order of the federal government. The Vanguard charity was officially dismantled, its remaining funds seized and redirected to an actual, legitimate medical rehabilitation program for wounded combat veterans. Arthur and Pierce Sterling were denied bail, classified as extreme flight risks due to their offshore accounts. They were moved to a high-security federal detention facility in West Virginia, awaiting a trial that everyone knew would end in life sentences without the possibility of parole. The family name was completely scrubbed from the city's skyline. The Sterling Vanguard Tower was bought out by a defense logistics firm, its flashing neon sign torn down by construction crews within a week. The empire built on humiliation had vanished as if it were nothing but smoke. 6 months later, the grand ballroom of the Lexingford Imperial was packed once again. But the atmosphere tonight was entirely different. There were no politicians buying influence, no fraudulent charity bosses looking for a photo op. The room was filled with hundreds of men and women in pristine military dress uniforms, the true backbone of the nation's defense forces. I stood in the wings of the stage, wearing my formal Class A uniform. My shoulder felt stiff, a lingering reminder of a shrapnel injury from my cover operations. But tonight, the pain didn't feel heavy. It felt like an honor. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone, his voice echoing clearly through the silent, respectful room. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are honored to present a recognition that has remained in the deep shadows for far too long. For extraordinary heroism, absolute tactical brilliance, and an unyielding commitment to the safety of our armed forces, the Department of the Army hereby awards the Distinguished Service Medal to Major Vivienne Vance. The entire ballroom rose to their feet in a massive, thunderous wave of applause. I walked out onto the stage, keeping my eyes fixed forward. The spotlight was bright, blindingly so, but as I reached the center of the stage, I looked toward the front row. Sitting there, wearing a simple, elegant dark dress, was my mother. Beside her sat my older sister, Clara, who had severed ties with Arthur years ago to live a quiet life far away from his madness. They weren't crying out of political theater. They were clapping with a deep, silent pride, their eyes shining with the tears of a family that had finally been liberated from a tyrant's shadow. General Rachel Vance stepped forward, holding the velvet case containing the medal. She pinned the brilliant gold and blue medal to my chest, her hand steady and precise. She stepped back, delivered a flawless, rigid salute, and smiled a genuine, warm expression that carried the ultimate validation of a commander. "Welcome home, Phantom Tempest," General Vance whispered. I returned the salute, the applause washing over me like a cleansing rain. This time, there was no mocking laugh waiting at the end of the night. There was no punchline designed to tear my spirit down. There was only the absolute, unshakable reality of what I had earned through my own sacrifice, my own strength, and my own unyielding silence. After the ceremony concluded, I walked out into the crisp, quiet night air of the city, leaving the celebration behind. I stood on the terrace overlooking the river, holding the small bronze challenge coin General Vance had returned to me earlier, the coin that marked the successful extraction of my team in the dark. In the end, the greatest victory of my life wasn't watching my father fall to his knees, nor was it seeing Pierce led away in chains. It wasn't even the gold medal pinning to my chest in front of 500 soldiers. The greatest victory was discovering that the truth doesn't need a microphone to be heard. It doesn't need to shout, it doesn't need to mock, and it doesn't need to buy its way into the light. The truth simply waits in the shadows, building its strength, until the storm arrives to tear down the lies. My mission was finally complete. The phantom tempest had passed, leaving behind a clean, open horizon.